Welcome to True Crime Kin channel, where we dive into real stories that shake the core of human relationships. Today's case is one of shocking betrayal, twisted emotions, and a tragic ending that no one saw coming. So let's begin. Lena and Michael Thompson appeared to have the perfect marriage. Together for 5 years, they lived in a beautiful suburban home, had successful careers, and were the envy of their friends. Michael's mother, Evelyn, was a frequent visitor, doting on both her son and daughter-in-law. To outsiders, their family seemed harmonious, but beneath the surface, secrets were brewing that would soon shatter their idyllic life. Evelyn, though charming and elegant, had a complicated past. She had married young, and after her husband's sudden death, she raised Michael on her own. Over the years, Evelyn had become not only a mother, but a best friend to Michael, maintaining a close, almost overprotective bond with him. Lena, initially grateful for Evelyn's kindness, began to feel suffocated by her presence. Unbeknownst to Michael, Lena and Evelyn shared a connection that went beyond the ordinary boundaries of a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law relationship. What started as innocent conversations evolved into a deep emotional bond and eventually a dangerous attraction. Both women knew the consequences if their secret ever came to light, but neither could resist the pull of their illicit relationship. It all started innocently enough, a late-night conversation over a glass of wine while Michael was out of town on business. Evelyn had confided in Lena about the loneliness she had felt since her husband's death, how difficult it had been to move on. Lena, who had her own struggles with Michael's long absences, found herself relating to Evelyn in ways she hadn't expected. As the night wore on, the conversation grew more personal, and before either of them knew it, they were sharing more than just their thoughts. A simple touch of hands led to a kiss, and that kiss ignited a passion that neither could deny. They both knew it was wrong, but the thrill of the forbidden made it impossible to stop. In the weeks that followed, Lena and Evelyn became more daring. Meeting in secret whenever they could, their affair was a dangerous dance filled with excitement and fear. They both knew that if Michael found out, it would destroy not just their relationship, but the entire family. But what they didn't realize was that someone was watching. Margaret, the Thompsons' next-door neighbor, had always been a bit of a busybody. She spent her days tending to her garden and watching the comings and goings in the neighborhood. Nothing escaped her notice, and lately, she had become increasingly curious about the frequent visits Evelyn made to the Thompson house, especially when Michael was away. Margaret's curiosity turned to suspicion when she noticed how often Lena and Evelyn would spend time together, often disappearing into the house for hours. She began to wonder if there was something more to their relationship than met the eye. At first, she dismissed the thought as ridiculous, but the more she observed, the more convinced she became that something was amiss. One evening, Margaret decided to take matters into her own hands. She positioned herself by her window, camera in hand, and waited. It wasn't long before she saw Evelyn's car pull up to the Thompsons' driveway. As usual, Michael was not home. Margaret watched as Evelyn entered the house, her heart racing with anticipation. She waited for what seemed like hours before finally catching a glimpse of something that confirmed her suspicions. A shadowy figure of the two women embracing through a gap in the curtains. Margaret snapped a few photos, her hands shaking with a mix of excitement and fear. She knew she had uncovered something explosive, but she wasn't sure what to do with the information. Should she confront Lena, tell Michael, or perhaps use the knowledge to her advantage? Unable to keep her discovery to herself, Margaret decided to pay Lena a visit. She knocked on the door one afternoon, her heart pounding. When Lena answered, Margaret smiled sweetly, masking her true intentions. "Lena, dear," Margaret began. "I couldn't help but notice that Evelyn has been visiting quite often lately. You two seem to be getting along so well." Lena felt a pang of unease at Margaret's words, but she forced a smile. "Yes, we've become quite close," she replied, trying to sound casual. Margaret nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly. "It's wonderful to see such a strong bond between family members. But you know, sometimes people can get the wrong idea when they see two women spending so much time together." Lena's heart skipped a beat. She could feel Margaret's gaze boring into her, and she knew that the older woman wasn't just making idle conversation. There was an underlying threat in her words. "What are you trying to say, Margaret?" Lena asked, her voice tense. Margaret's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, nothing much. Just that I'd hate for anyone to get the wrong impression." You wouldn't want Michael to misunderstand, would you? Lena felt a wave of panic wash over her. Margaret knew somehow she had figured out what was going on. Lena struggled to maintain her composure, but Margaret could see the fear in her eyes. Of course, I'm sure we can keep this between us, Margaret continued, her tone syrupy sweet. After all, I wouldn't want to cause any trouble, but perhaps you could help me with a little problem of my own. Lena knew exactly what Margaret was asking. The older woman was blackmailing her, and there was little she could do about it. If she refused, Margaret would surely tell Michael, and everything would come crashing down. Over the next few weeks, Lena found herself trapped in Margaret's web. The older woman made increasingly demanding requests, each one more outrageous than the last. Margaret wanted money, favors, and even access to the Thompsons' business contacts. Lena complied with her demands, desperate to keep her secret safe, but the stress was taking its toll. Evelyn noticed the change in Lena. She became withdrawn, nervous, and constantly on edge. Evelyn tried to comfort her, but Lena was too afraid to confide in her. She couldn't risk Evelyn's involvement, knowing that it would only make things worse. But Margaret wasn't satisfied with just blackmailing Lena. She wanted more power, more control. And she began to hint that she might tell Michael anyway, just to see what would happen. The thought of losing everything pushed Lena to the brink, and one night, in a moment of desperation, she made a fateful decision. Lena invited Margaret over for tea, pretending to have finally given in to her demands. She laced Margaret's drink with a lethal dose of poison, watching with a mixture of horror and relief as the older woman sipped the tea, unaware of the deadly trap. Within minutes, Margaret began to convulse, clutching her throat as the poison took effect. Lena stood frozen, watching as Margaret collapsed to the floor, her body twitching before finally going still. The room was silent, save for the sound of Lena's own ragged breathing. She had committed murder to protect her secret, but instead of feeling relief, Lena was overcome with a crushing sense of guilt and dread. What had she done? Panicking, Lena knew she had to act fast. She couldn't let anyone discover what had happened, especially Evelyn. She quickly wrapped Margaret's lifeless body in a large rug and dragged it out to the garage. The weight of the body was heavier than she anticipated, and every sound seemed magnified in the stillness of the night. Once in the garage, Lena loaded Margaret's body into the trunk of her car. She drove out to a remote area in the countryside, heart pounding with every passing mile. The darkness seemed to close in around her, and the isolation of the area added to her growing paranoia. Lena found a secluded spot by the edge of a river where she hastily dug a shallow grave. Her hands shook as she buried Margaret's body, every sound in the night making her jump. She worked quickly, her mind racing with fear and regret. As she covered the grave with dirt, she hoped that the rushing water of the river would wash away any trace of what she had done. When she finally returned home, Lena was exhausted and numb. She cleaned the house meticulously, scrubbing away any evidence of Margaret's presence. By the time she finished, the sun was beginning to rise, casting an eerie light on her now spotless home. But as she sat down to rest, the weight of her actions began to settle in. She had killed someone to protect her affair with Evelyn, and now there was no going back. Days turned into weeks, and Lena tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. She pretended that Margaret had simply gone on an impromptu vacation, as she often did, but the guilt gnawed at her, and she found it increasingly difficult to keep up the charade. The police eventually showed up at Lena's door. Detective John Mercer, a seasoned investigator with a keen sense for when something was amiss, had been assigned to look into Margaret's sudden disappearance. Although it was common for Margaret to leave town without notice, something about this time felt different. Detective Mercer began his investigation by interviewing the neighbors, many of whom were more than willing to share their thoughts. The stories were mostly consistent. Margaret was a busybody, always prying into other people's business, and it wasn't unusual for her to disappear for a while. But when Mercer reached the Thompson household, he sensed a different kind of tension. Lena did her best to appear calm and cooperative, but Detective Mercer noticed the slight tremor in her voice, the way her eyes darted nervously whenever Margaret's name was mentioned. He also found it odd that Evelyn, who had been so close to Margaret, seemed strangely detached from the situation. As the days passed, Mercer's suspicions grew. He began to dig deeper into the Thompsons' lives, uncovering subtle inconsistencies in Lena's story. There were gaps in her timeline on the night Margaret disappeared, and her explanation for her whereabouts didn't quite add up. Mercer wasn't ready to make any accusations, but he knew there was more to this story. He decided to keep a close eye on Lena, hoping that the pressure would eventually cause her to slip up. Meanwhile, Evelyn began to notice the strain that Lena was under. The once vibrant and confident woman she had fallen in love with was now a shadow of her former self. Worried that something was seriously wrong, Evelyn confronted Lena one evening, pressing her to reveal what was bothering her. Lena, unable to hold in her guilt any longer, broke down in tears and confessed everything. She told Evelyn about the blackmail, about Margaret's threats, and about the murder. She expected Evelyn to be horrified, to reject her, but instead Evelyn listened quietly, her face betraying little emotion. When Lena finished, Evelyn took her hands and looked into her eyes. "You did what you had to do," she said calmly. "Margaret was a threat to us, and you protected our secret. But now we must be even more careful. We can't let anyone find out what happened." Evelyn's cold acceptance of the situation shocked Lena. She had expected some kind of comfort, maybe even an offer to turn themselves in. But instead, Evelyn was already planning their next move. It was then that Lena realized just how far Evelyn was willing to go to protect their relationship. As Detective Mercer continued his investigation, he became increasingly convinced that Lena was hiding something. His persistence began to make Lena and Evelyn nervous, and they knew it was only a matter of time before he uncovered the truth. Evelyn, ever the pragmatist, suggested a drastic solution: eliminate Mercer before he could get too close. At first, Lena was horrified by the idea, but Evelyn's calm reasoning began to wear her down. If they didn't act, they risked everything. Late one night, as Mercer worked late in his office, Evelyn made her move. She called Mercer, pretending to be a concerned citizen with information about Margaret's disappearance. She lured him to a deserted area under the guise of meeting an informant. Mercer, ever the diligent detective, took the bait. When Mercer arrived at the location, he found himself alone. As he searched the area, Lena appeared from the shadows, her hands trembling as she held a gun. Mercer barely had time to react before Lena, tears streaming down her face, pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the night, and Mercer fell to the ground, clutching his chest. Lena stood over him, her whole body shaking with the realization of what she had just done. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. With Mercer dead, Lena and Evelyn quickly set about covering their tracks. They planted false evidence to make it look like Mercer had been investigating a drug ring and was killed by a criminal informant. The police, shocked by the murder of one of their own, bought the story and began a manhunt for the supposed killer. But despite their efforts, cracks in the cover-up began to appear. Mercer had been meticulous in his work, and his notes revealed that he had been investigating Lena and Evelyn more closely than they had realized. The false leads they had planted started to fall apart under closer scrutiny, and soon the police began to question whether Mercer's death was really related to his official investigation. As the pressure mounted, Lena's guilt became unbearable. She started having nightmares, reliving the moment she shot Mercer over and over again. Evelyn, on the other hand, remained cold and detached, focused only on keeping them safe. But the strain was starting to show even on her. Lena began to distance herself from Evelyn, unable to reconcile the love she once felt with the horror of what they had done. Evelyn noticed the change and became increasingly paranoid. That Lena might break under the pressure. Lena's mental state continued to deteriorate. She became increasingly paranoid, convinced that the police were closing in on them. Her relationship with Evelyn grew strained, the guilt and fear driving a wedge between them. Evelyn, sensing that Lena was on the verge of a breakdown, decided to take matters into her own hands. One evening, as they sat together in silence, Evelyn turned to Lena and suggested that they run away together, leaving everything behind. But Lena, now overwhelmed with guilt and self-loathing, refused. She couldn't live with herself, knowing what they had done. Evelyn's face hardened, and Lena realized that Evelyn wasn't asking, she was ordering. The realization that Evelyn was willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to protect herself sent a chill down Lena's spine. Lena began to secretly plan her escape, but Evelyn was always one step ahead. One night, Lena woke to find Evelyn standing over her, a syringe in hand. "I can't let you leave, Lena," Evelyn whispered, her voice devoid of emotion. "You're the only one who knows the truth." Lena barely managed to fend off Evelyn's attack, the struggle leaving her shaken and terrified. She knew then that Evelyn had crossed a line and would stop at nothing to protect herself, even if it meant killing Lena. With nowhere to turn, Lena went into hiding, leaving behind everything she knew. She changed her appearance, moved to a different city and tried to start over. But the weight of her guilt and the constant fear of Evelyn finding her made it impossible to find peace. Evelyn, enraged by Lena's betrayal, used all her resources to track her down. Her obsession with finding Lena grew, consuming her every waking moment. As Evelyn's search intensified, she began to unravel her once calm and calculating demeanor, giving way to paranoia and madness. Meanwhile, Lena, isolated and alone, began to descend into her own form of madness. The guilt of her actions, the fear of Evelyn's revenge, and the nightmares that haunted her every night took their toll. She became a shadow of her former self, constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for the day Evelyn would find her. Lena's fears were realized one cold, rainy night when Evelyn finally tracked her down. Lena, who had been living in a dingy apartment under a false name, came home to find Evelyn waiting for her, a gun in hand. The two women faced each other, the tension between them thick in the air. Evelyn's eyes were wild, her once perfectly composed exterior shattered by months of obsessive hunting. Lena, exhausted and broken, could only stare at the woman she had once loved, now a monster driven by fear and rage. Evelyn raised the gun, her hand trembling. "Why did you run, Lena?" she asked, her voice cracking. "We could have been together. We could have made it work." Lena shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I couldn't live with the guilt, Evelyn. We've done terrible things. We're not the same people we used to be." Evelyn's face contorted with anger. "We could have had everything, Lena, but you ruined it." She stepped closer, the gun now inches from Lena's face. "You ruined everything." In a moment of desperation, Lena lunged at Evelyn. Knocking the gun from her hand, the two women struggled, their fight fueled by years of repressed emotions and guilt. The gun went off in the scuffle, the sound echoing through the empty apartment. When the dust settled, Evelyn lay on the floor, blood pooling around her. The bullet had struck her in the chest, and she was dying. Lena, kneeling beside her, watched in horror as the life drained from the woman she had once loved. The police arrived shortly after. Responding to reports of gunfire from neighbors, they found Lena sitting beside Evelyn's body, her hands covered in blood, her face blank with shock. The once vibrant woman was now a hollow shell, her mind shattered by the events that had unfolded. Lena was arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including the murders of Margaret and Detective Mercer. The trial was swift, and despite her attempts to explain her actions, the jury found her guilty. The media painted Lena as a cold-blooded killer, a woman who had let her twisted love affair with her mother-in-law drive her to commit unspeakable acts. But the truth was more complicated than that. Lena had been a victim of her own desires, manipulated by a woman who had taken advantage of her vulnerability. In the end, both women had paid the ultimate price for their forbidden love. Lena was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. She spent her days in a maximum security facility. Haunted by the memories of what she had done, the other inmates viewed her with a mix of fear and curiosity. But Lena kept to herself, too broken to care about anything anymore. Years passed, and the story of Lena and Evelyn Thompson faded from the public's memory. The house they had once shared was sold to a new family, the ghosts of the past buried beneath layers of paint and renovations. But the tragedy that had unfolded within those walls lingered in the memories of those who had been touched by it. Lena, now older and more withdrawn, spent her days in prison reflecting on the choices that had led her to this point. She had loved Evelyn with a passion that defied reason, but that love had turned toxic, consuming them both. She realized too late that she had been blind to Evelyn's manipulations, that her own desires had clouded her judgment. In her final years, Lena became a recluse, refusing visitors and rarely speaking to anyone. She lived in a state of quiet resignation, accepting her fate but never fully at peace with it. The guilt and shame of what she had done were her constant companions, reminding her daily of the lives she had destroyed. One day, a young journalist reached out to Lena, hoping to write a book about her life and the events that had led to the murders. At first, Lena refused, wanting nothing more than to leave the past buried. But as time went on, she reconsidered. Realizing that telling her story might serve as a warning to others about the dangers of letting love turn into obsession, the book, when it was finally published, became a sensation. It painted a complex picture of Lena Thompson, neither fully villain nor victim, but a woman caught in a web of her own making. Readers were captivated by the tragic love story, the twisted relationship between Lena and Evelyn, and the dark spiral that had led to so much death. In the end, Lena passed away quietly in her sleep, her life ending as it had been lived in its final years, alone and filled with regret. Her story, however, lived on a cautionary tale of how love can turn deadly when it becomes entangled with secrets, lies, and the need for control. The house where it all began remained standing, a silent witness to the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. But now it was just a house. Its dark history hidden beneath the surface, waiting for time to erase the memories of what had happened there. As the years passed, the story of Lena and Evelyn Thompson faded into the annals of forgotten crimes. But for those who knew the truth, it remained a haunting reminder of how easily love can become a force of destruction.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like this video for more true crime video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Take care and see you in the next video.